On this edition of the program, we talked to real Carl Allen to find out if the polls were right in 2024 and what we should think about them going forward. It's all coming up.
The following is brought to you by Just Another Pilot.
Hello and welcome everybody to the Politics program for November 15th, 2024. Your old pal Justin Robert Young joining you here. A lot going on. We're going to get into the update a little bit later in the show with all the news. Matt Gaetz's ethics investigation in the House leaked to ABC. We have RFK Jr. getting Health and Human Services. RFK Jr. now a member of the Trump administration and more. But before we do any of that, I wanted to bring on one of the voices that we liked the most in the waning days of the 2024 campaign, talking about not only polling, but also how we should think about polling. You guys heard me a lot when I talked about polls that were coming in to not look at the spread, Donald Trump +2, +3, Harris +1, +2, but rather to look at vote share, because that was going to give you a better indication of how things would end up. And us looking at that tended to be predictive of states where Kamala Harris really had problems and showed Donald Trump to be increasingly competitive, not only in the states that he eventually won by winning all 7 swing states, but the national popular vote, which by the end of it, he was winning in the aggregate. And so we talk again to real Carl Allen. Here we go. As we continue to understand what happened last week, one of the big questions that will be talked about and should be talked about is, were the polls right? What were they right about? What were they wrong about? And one of the listeners' favorite voices that we had in the run-up to the end of this election season was real Carl Allen. He has a fantastic Substack, and he is a great follow. Carl, this is an interesting moment, because from my sense of it was that in general, at least election night, I kind of felt like the polls got stuff right directionally. It showed leads in places that wound up becoming wins for Donald Trump. It showed a ticket splitting effect that certainly wound up saving the Democrats from a generationally abysmal night in the Senate, something that might have kept the chamber away from them for at least 1 or 2 cycles. But then I looked again today, and some of the misses were a little bit larger than I thought. You track this very closely and have some fundamental problems with just the way that we talk about polling in general.
Right.
Give me your top line.
Yeah. So coming into the election, in every podcast that I spoke on, I was very, very careful with my wording. I had Kamala Harris as a medium favorite coming into the election, not because I thought she would win easily, not because I thought Donald Trump didn't have a chance to hit 50% in any state. I said that Kamala Harris's strength is in the blue wall. And if she wins those 3 blue wall states, then she wins the election. Yes, she has a chance in North Carolina. Yes, she has a chance in Georgia. She even has an outside chance in Arizona, were pretty much my words. But the problem with that is, once that safety net cracked in North Carolina and Georgia, that is when a lot of people, the red flags went up of, oh, something is wrong here. Like, Trump was probably favored in North Carolina and Georgia, not just because he was ahead in the polls there, but because that's where he had been stronger in the past. North Carolina, he hit 50% in 2020, I believe. 2016, he hit 50% in Georgia. That wasn't entirely unexpected. The problem for Democrats came when we started getting results in from the blue wall. top line, what we have to understand about polls is they're not trying to give us a projection or a prediction of the election result. They're trying to tell us these candidates will probably get at least this many votes. And across the board, that if we took a poll average, now I'm not talking about any individual poll, but by looking at the poll averages across the board, that's what happened. And the result was not what I wanted it to be. So I've been very careful about not going on podcasts and talking too much on social media about, oh, the polls were fine, everything was fine. Like, the result wasn't what I wanted it to be. So I've been careful with my words. But the reality is the polls told us that the election was going to be close, regardless of who won. And that is almost exactly what happened. Trump's performance in the popular vote surprised me. That New York, New Jersey, a lot of these states swung pretty strongly to the right. His performance with the popular vote surprised me. But big picture, overall, I would say the polls did quite well this year.
Yeah, one of the things that you pointed out that I have been obsessed about since in your writing, what made me bring you on was to not look at any of the spreads, but rather to look at the vote shares in each of the polls in aggregate to give us a sense of things. And I don't think that anybody who pays attention to this kind of stuff, unless you had a crystal ball, would have assumed that Donald Trump would be cracking 50 in all these states where he hadn't before. That historically did not lead to a predictive sense for that. But let's just look through here. And I know that Real Clear Politics average is its own controversial thing, but we're just going to use that as a standard here. Yep. Looking at the blue wall, Donald Trump's RCP average in terms of vote share was 48.5%. He got 2 full points over that. In Wisconsin, it was 48.6. He barely did that. So the polls were actually really, really accurate in Wisconsin, at least understanding Donald Trump's vote share.
Yep.
In Michigan, he did nearly 2 full points better than his vote share. Almost nearly cracked 50% in Michigan, which turned out to be a more conservative state than Wisconsin, which has historically not been the case.
Right.
But it seems like the polls were better at understanding Donald Trump's universe of voters, although it still underestimated them. Is this just because of shifting demographics? How much of this is the Trump campaign, in your mind, just electrifying dead cable of people that weren't voters before, but they got him out to go do it? And how much of it is Donald Trump just taking from Democratic constituencies, people that used to be that used to be Democratic voters that were voters for Biden that now pulled the lever for Trump?
Yeah. So we know in every swing state, because they're swing states, the margins are going to be very close, right? So the strategy for both campaigns, and for pretty much every political campaign in every swing state, it is number one, turn out your base. So for Donald Trump, for Kamala Harris, whatever their base is, 46%, 47, 48%, make sure you're turning out your base and you're maximizing your support among them. And also, you're trying to reduce the margins in the areas where you're weaker. So Kamala Harris adopted something of a John Fetterman strategy in Pennsylvania, where she was in the rural areas trying to bring down those huge margins that Trump was running up in the rural areas. To combat that, what Trump was trying to do was to cut down on the margins in the big cities. He was trying to get young people, African Americans, Hispanic voters. He was trying to cut into those margins where Democrats did traditionally well. So both campaigns were doing kind of what you would expect. But what ended up happening was Donald Trump improved his margins with black voters. He improved his margins with Hispanic voters. He improved his margins with young people. And we're not talking, obviously, look, in Wisconsin, he got 49.7. Michigan, same ballpark. He didn't blow anything away, but he got just above that 49% threshold that we were talking about in the last podcast. He got just enough above that to win the election. And that ultimately, when we're talking about close elections, 50,000 voters, 100,000 voters, that is who ultimately decides these elections.
And that, there's a lot of conversation about how Kamala Harris had a bunch of people stay home. And I think that that's kind of been pushed back over the last 4 days, that Kamala Harris actually, especially in the blue wall states, did not do terribly. I wrote a Substack saying that if Kamala Harris's vote, or if her poll aggregates are in the 47s, then Donald Trump is the 47th president of the United States. But she didn't do that. In Pennsylvania, she had 48.4% of the vote. In Wisconsin, she had 48.8%, and in Michigan it was 48.3. These are numbers that in the past would have beaten, or at least been very competitive with Donald Trump. I don't know if they would have that they would have won all three, which is what she needed to do, and then they also needed to win the Nebraska too, which I don't know. Right. I know Don Bacon won it. I don't know if Kamala Harris won Nebraska too.
She did. Harris did win Nebraska too.
Harris did win.
Yeah.
So she would have done everything she needed to do had she held everything down in the blue wall. But it was just that Donald Trump overperformed, and that's the big thing that I wanted people to take away from this is, if there is a strategic thing that I believe certainly the Democratic strategic apparatus and a lot of the media really missed is, hey, Donald Trump's popular. He's a popular politician, and he turned out people that were, not only not otherwise going to turn out, but also he did bring down some of those margins in places that he really needed to do. The Trump campaign was strategically well run. They were competent. They had a plan. They executed it.
Yep. And again, the benefit that Trump had going into this election, and the benefit he has going into every election, is that his base is very, very high. His base is not only high in number, but also high in motivation. So the thing that worried me a little bit was I was seeing numbers among pollsters that said Democratic motivation was much higher than Republican motivation.
Yeah, where the hell did that come from?
Now, I don't actually discredit, or I don't disbelieve that. But again, MAGA and Republican are different. They're not always the same category. So I would say, again, discounting the possibility that Donald Trump could get to 48% in all of these swing states, I think was misguided. Now, the fact that he got 50.5 in Pennsylvania surprised me a little bit, because I thought Harris was slightly stronger in Pennsylvania than in a place like Wisconsin. But again, regardless, we're looking at about 100,000 votes in Pennsylvania, about 50,000 votes in Wisconsin and Michigan that Trump picked up versus 2020. I'm not talking about percentages, just if we look at the gross numbers of voters, more votes that he got than 2020, his vote share went up a little bit. And Kamala Harris's were basically flat and only went up a little bit less. And ultimately, when we're talking, again, close elections, you have to maximize your performance. You have to do the best you can among all of your constituencies. There's not like a one demographic, one thing, if only we had done this different. It's all, you have to do all of it, because those 10,000 votes in this demographic, 10,000 votes in this demographic, they add up to a win or a loss.
And that's, I remember a friend of mine, kind of scoffing at the idea that Donald Trump's team was at, Happy Valley, Pennsylvania, and Penn State registering voters, because at any other time in any other election, the idea of going to a college campus to register college kids to vote would be suicide for a Republican campaign. That was not the case. There were significant gains made upon, especially Gen Z men. That has been a pretty sky blue demographic up until now, and that is the case. All right. Regardless of this election in particular, and it does appear that probably the bigger misses, weirdly, were not in the blue wall states, which I do think were polled pretty well, but certainly Nevada had, I think, a 5-point miss for Donald on Donald Trump's vote share. Arizona, which was already polling as the most aggressively pro-Trump, had like a 3-point miss. So it was weirdly in some of these the Western Sunbelt states where there were the biggest misses in terms of vote share specifically. But you have been very critical about how we understand polling, especially the quant revolution that has come about it. I always love this period of time after an election because everybody, all the tourists leave. They all go back to, caring about other things. All the nerds stay, but we can have a little bit more of an honest conversation about like, okay, well, going forward, let's take everything that we've learned. Let's take where the public's understanding of this is. Obviously, there's a certain element of liberal America that is saying to themselves, if they were blindsided, why did I pay attention to this? How can I be smarter going forward? If you were the czar of polling, you got the Trump appointment for polling czar, what would be your edicts?
So first of all, I have to point out that when we talk about vote share in a poll, that's not a projection of their result. That is an estimated base of support. Because again, the vote share in the poll does not include undecideds. So the top two candidates rarely add up to 100%. So we should actually expect both candidates to outperform their vote share in poll averages. We should expect them to outperform their vote share. The assumption that happens right now, to get to your point about quants, the assumption right now is that each candidate will outperform their vote share equally in every state, in every poll average, in every election that has ever happened, that each candidate should outperform their vote share equally. Undecided should split 50-50, and that any discrepancy from that is indicative of a poll error, and that is the size of the poll error. No questions asked, no asterisk, no fine print. And so when I'm looking at different swing states, so when I look at a state, for example, like Arizona is an interesting state because of their demographics, their partisan lean history, etc. But if I'm quantifying an undecided voter in Arizona, that is very, very different than quantifying an undecided voter in Colorado. Because again, the likely demographics of those voters skew differently. So the blanket assumption of 50-50 is extremely poor. So if I were in charge of polls, I would, and I talk about this in my book, I don't think this is what we should do. This is what we should do. But if the goal was solely to inform people and not to create content, clicks, generate revenue, I would release poll numbers, not individually, but as an average. And I would release them probably weekly or bi-weekly. No individual pollsters, no individual poll numbers. I would release the average of the polls from that week weekly and say, hey, this is the average. No discussion of who's ahead, by how much, none of that, just the average, and no individual pollsters. Because as you know, what happened during the election, every time a new poll came out, this person's up. Oh, now this person's up. Oh, now it's tied. Now it's a back and forth kind of thing. The reality is, if you understand poll data, we should expect some kind of movement. The challenging thing for people to understand is that just because someone is ahead in the poll average isn't a prediction that they will win. You can put a probability on it, but you can't say that they were ahead in the polls, but then they lost, therefore the polls were wrong, which is legitimately 100% the current level of understanding among the experts in the field. So again, if I were in charge, it would be kind of zoom out. Let's take a scientific approach. Let's not obsess over this granular individual poll data. Let's talk about an average. And instead of releasing stuff every day, let's do it every week or every other week.
So that would seem to be, you are solving for people overreacting to things. You are solving for tribalism. You are solving for, and I know that you are somebody who has been very critical of Nate Silver, but I think that we could all agree. I believe he said that during the last 2 months of an election, people tend to lose about 60 IQ points as we get closer and closer to election day. That is bringing down the temperature there. It reduces the idea of Republicans screaming about Ann Seltzer, whether or not that poll turns out to be hilariously wrong, but still, she is a respected pollster. She has well earned her right to have a big miss. And on the other side, you have something like Atlas Intel, which was very accurate. And as they continue to tilt the race further and further toward Donald Trump, showing larger and larger margins that actually wound up happening, I saw a lot of my more progressive and liberal follows that pay attention to this kind of stuff completely discount them and call them total thumb on the scale outliers. Of course, we don't know in any of these cases, and like you've said, the larger worth of these individual data points is to throw them all in a bag and then shake them up and see exactly where the average is at the end of the day. I don't know if we're ever going to live in that world, because there are people that really love this stuff and they want every little bit of data.
I think the perception of data, the illusion of data, is sometimes worse than no data. That the most recent poll or the feeling that your candidate is ahead, because again, our minds are wired to accept information that we like and to reject information that we don't. So when that Seltzer poll came out, I was very adamantly talking to people who were on my side of the voting aisle, that I said, look, guys, this does not mean that Harris will probably win Iowa. This does not mean that Harris will win Iowa. This means that she has a slightly better chance of getting 47% in Iowa than we originally thought. And that's all it did in my forecast. Was it pushed the poll averages about a tenth or 2/10 to the right, to closer to 47, pushed her average to like 45 or something like that. And it widened my error bars a little bit. I said, okay, maybe she gets to 49 in Iowa, right? But again, she wasn't favored in Iowa. And this obsession over individual polls is the illusion of data. It's feeling like there's information when really there's very little or almost none. I am not saying that we should put all polls in a bag and take the average. That's not exactly what I'm saying. That approach is better than any individual poll, but polls really aren't meant to be averaged together, because polls have different methodologies. They ask the question a different way. They have different weighting techniques. So averaging different polls is a weird way of trying to get a more accurate number. It's not necessarily the best approach. But when we talk about Seltzer, when we talk about Atlas Intel, I have to give you a very short history lesson from the book. Do you have 30 seconds?
Please.
All
please.
Right. The first political pollster, the first company that's credited for being the first political pollsters, were Literary Digest. They were a famous magazine. They had a huge mailing list. And what they did is they sent out fake ballots, and they said, okay, this is a poll. This isn't real, but who would you vote for? And give or take 20% of people returned those ballots. So we know right away that not everyone's responding. That could cause some problems, right? But for four elections in a row, they were within 2% of the actual vote share for each presidential candidate for 4 elections in a row. Now, in your mind, let's go back 4 elections: 2008, 2012, 2016, 2020. Imagine if there had been a pollster in the U.S. who had been within 2 points in all of the swing states, national popular vote, whatever, in every single election. They would become this gold standard. They would become the best pollster in the world. But in reality, all we're doing is we're treating this poll as a prediction and judging them by that standard. So what happened with Literary Digest? In that 5th election, their sample was very poor. They did it the same way they had always done it, by the way. They sent out the ballots. They returned it. They said, these are the numbers. The candidate that they thought would get 57% of the vote got 37% of the vote. Enormous, catastrophic error. The error was so bad, they went out of business. And suddenly, all of these experts in poll data, all of these experts in the field were like, yeah, of course, their polls were bad because they weren't taking a random sample. They didn't weight their data how they should. After the fact, it was so obvious why they had missed. But they're missing the bigger point. The point is, You're judging this pollster not by their technique, not by their weighting, not by their sample, not by any relevant factor. You're simply judging them by how close they are to the result and saying if they predicted the result, then they are a good pollster. And that is the Literary Digest standard, which is the fundamental ignorance that has existed in this field for 100 years. So G. Elliott Morris in his book, Nate Silver in his posts, they always make fun of the Literary Digest for their catastrophic miss, their terrible, horrible miss in 1936. They make fun of them for being so far off. Yeah. And yet they apply that exact same reasoning to who the best pollsters are today. So I asked them straight up. I say, look, Nate, G. Elliott, whoever's studying polls right now, put yourself a day before the election, 1936. The Literary Digest has gotten 4 in a row within 2 points. Would you then have been able to say, I don't care how close they were to the result, their polls aren't good, I'm not going to treat them as a gold standard? The answer is no, you wouldn't have. Your definitions prove it, your words prove it. So I'm not interested in debating science and statistics with people who demonstrate that they don't understand how polls work. They're applying the same standards that were applied 100 years ago when polls failed. So when someone says Atlas Intel has been the best pollster twice in a row, congratulations, 2 more to go, and then you can be up there with Literary Digest. I don't give a shit. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. It's ignorant. Atlas Intel might be a very good pollster. I've looked at their methodology. They do polls in many countries. They just did one in France. They did one in a couple other countries. And I'm like, okay, maybe they're a good pollster. I need more data to support that. The fact that they're close on the vote share or close on the margin doesn't cut it for me. And if it does cut it, and this is getting to we're talking to the real quants right now, no observers here. If we're getting to the real underlying reasoning why a pollster is good, they were close on the margin is I don't give a shit. It literally doesn't matter. I could have been close on the margin. That doesn't mean my poll was good.
This is your update brought to you by TakePoliticsSeriously.com. Guys, if you thought the Trump administration was going to be boring, it's not. Spoiler alert. There's a lot going on here. Donald Trump naming his cabinet quite a few crazy names. I mean, I'll just put it this way. The week started, with folks aghast that a 20-year veteran and double Ivy who happened to be on Fox News and has underwear photos on the internet was named the head of the Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense. That's what started it. That's what was made for jaw-dropping news at the beginning of the week. And now the man who was said to have brainworms during the campaign, who survived a sex scandal during the campaign, who admitted to accidentally killing a bear and throwing it in Central Park, is now the head of Health and Human Services. You're going to want more details on all of this. And that's why you need to go to Take Politics Seriously. That's why you need to sign up for that $99 deal. That's why, to be totally honest, if you want somebody to get a better, more balanced understanding of this news, if they were turned off by the partisan media, and I'm hearing that a lot, partisan media led you astray, go ahead. Give the gift of PX3 this holiday season. You can do that at TakePoliticsSeriously.com. And a reminder, our $99 deal, 150 episodes of PX3 for under $100. Well, that's available too. $99. Cheapest that we've ever offered it. It is $40 less than it was on Patreon. Let's get into all the news that we didn't have a chance to get into. Thursday, on our bonus episode, we broke the news, or talked about the breaking news, that Matt Gaetz is Donald Trump's attorney general nominee. And we mentioned there was a House Ethics Committee investigation that was going to be voted on to be released at the end of this week. We said it wasn't going to stay secret for long, and lo, it has not, because the House Ethics Committee did indeed investigate Matt Gaetz, according to ABC News, over allegations of sexual misconduct and illicit drug use, and got testimony from a woman claiming Gaetz had sex with her when she was 17. The Justice Department had a years-long probe into similar allegations, including claims from Gaetz's former friend, Joel Greenberg. Now, those concluded without charges, but they are recounted apparently in this House Ethics Committee. Of course, that is now going to be the same department that Gaetz would head, the DOJ, should he take the job as Attorney General. We will obviously be following whether or not that will happen by way of confirmation. The Ethics Committee's final report took testimonies, Venmo records, and statements from multiple witnesses, including Gaetz's former girlfriend, and supported claims of that there were paid parties involving drugs, with Gaetz denying any involvement in illegal activities. So, here's my take on this. I was wondering whether or not there'd be anything new in this investigation. It was the 17-year-old woman talking to the Department of Justice and the testimony of Joel Greenberg, who is just a piece of work, a Florida man, true and true. A guy who once got elected to local government and then burned down the local government facility because he was running his Bitcoin mining farm too hot. But what we don't know is, did Matt Gaetz know the woman was 17 when she had sex with him? In fact, we have heard the exact opposite, that she willfully misrepresented how old she was. And if that's the case, then that's the case. It's something that we had already heard. Now, is it unseemly? Oh, yeah. Oh, it's unseemly. It is unseemly. Is it unseemly on congressional standards? You know, there's a lot of members that come through Congress. I would be shocked to find out that Matt Gaetz might be the only congressperson single congressperson who did cocaine and had sex with teenagers. But there we go. It doesn't appear that any details from the House ethics investigation are different than the DOJ stuff. So anybody who already found Matt Gaetz totally disqualified by what we knew about the DOJ stuff, which was not enough to charge him, we now know again. There we go. President-elect Trump has indeed nominated Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as the head of the Department of Health and Human Services, promising Kennedy significant influence over health and food policies. Kennedy, who is known for promoting his skepticism to vaccine autism links and criticizing regulatory agencies, may indeed face challenges in the Senate confirmation, though some Republican senators remain neutral. Trump cited a commitment to protect Americans from industrial and pharmaceutical harms, while Democrats, including House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, questioned Kennedy's qualifications. Kennedy has stated he will not remove vaccine access and advocates for informed choice based on transparent safety studies. What a world, man. What a world. This has been circulating on Twitter that Obama was thinking about appointing RFK Jr. to his administration. But that was EPA back in 2008. And now here he is, the jacked son of Bobby Kennedy, is in the White House. The final marriage of the Kennedy family and the Trump administration is complete. I feel like we're going to talk a lot more about this going forward, but we might have to do next week. In fact, we're definitely going to do this next week. We're going to rank the most difficult confirmation nominees to the easiest, right? Marco Rubio is the easiest. Who's the hardest? And it's going to be a challenge between RFK Jr. and Matt Gaetz. Probably Matt Gaetz, but RFK Jr. is going to give him a run for his money. And now let's switch on over to the Democratic side. David Axelrod is advocating for Rahm Emanuel, the U.S. ambassador to Japan, to chair the Democratic National Committee. On his podcast, Axelrod highlighted Emanuel's political expertise, noting his extensive experience as a congressman, a White House chief of staff, a Chicago mayor, and a campaign strategist. Known as a tough political operator, the Godfather, they used to call him. Emanuel's record includes helping Democrats reclaim the House in 2006 and serving 3 presidents. With Jamie Harrison not seeking another term as DNC chair, Axelrod sees Emanuel as a fearless leader capable of challenging Trump and navigating media, fundraising, and election strategy effectively. Emanuel is expected to leave Tokyo in November. He also has a tie to his brother, Ari Emanuel. That is your update. TakePoliticsSeriously.com. It is the methodology. It is trying to understand exactly how you are getting this data. And, if the argument for the kind of like quote unquote flood the zone polls is that, all right, you had conservative leaning pollsters that believed that polls were undervaluing Trump vote, which may or may not have been statistically true, certainly seemed to be statistically true, at least in terms of vote share in some of the swing states this time. It doesn't matter if you put your thumb on the scale to get it closer to where it might be. You're not actually solving the problem. You are not actually finding a way to statistically measure some of these voters that are going to come out. It seems like people did get better compared to 2016 and 2020 at understanding those unlikely Donald Trump voters. They were good at measuring the idea that Donald Trump was more popular than he had been in the past. So there were signs for which you could say that, okay, this is more fertile ground for him to get up beyond where he had in the past. But just creating a poll that says, okay, well, just +2 to Trump's vote share because it's probably going to be +2 is just you stapling something on.
Bingo. Yep. I addressed this problem very directly in my book. In the UK in 2017, they did exactly this. Their polls had consistently underrated conservative candidates. And so what they did is they just started adding a few points to conservatives in the poll numbers. This isn't, to your point, and you said it perfectly, this isn't solving any problems. All we're doing is giving the illusion of we know what will happen. When in reality, if you're not reaching these people and you don't have a valid, objective, repeatable way to weight your data, all you're doing is guessing. All you're doing is making stuff up. Is that the data that we want in our polls? Do we want the best guess of Atlas Intel? Do we want the best guess of Marist? Do we want the best guess of Siena? Or do we want the data as it actually is to allow us to say, okay, maybe we're not talking to enough young MAGAs, right? We're not talking to enough young white males, or maybe we're oversampling this group. That, to me, I would rather the polls be off by some appropriate metric and allow us to be able to go back and figure out why, than to arbitrarily overstate somebody's support with the idea that, well, they're probably going to overperform it and I don't want my poll to be wrong. I don't think that's happening across the board, but when we look at partisan pollsters in 2016, 2020, the pollsters that were graded the highest had very poor methodology, and yet because they overstated Trump's support, they received a better grade on the back.
They were more accurate. Yeah. So let me ask you this then. Would you just do away or maybe have a different sort of certification for the idea of grades, which have become the way that people understand good and bad pollsters? We just kind of, including myself, and I've done this on the show all the time, that, something like Vote Hub, it's like, oh, well, they only include A+ and B+ pollsters. I have no idea what an A+ or B+ pollster is, aside from a bunch of pointy-headed quants have said that this is an A+ or a B+ pollster.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess it's a way for the dumbs like me to wrap my head around it. But If to your point, no doubt with 538, no doubt with Nate Silver, if past his prologue with what they're going to do now, something like Atlas Intel will probably be an A-plus pollster, if simply because their numbers were closer to the way that the numbers actually turned out.
Yep. To their credit, when G. Elliott Morris took over 538, he introduced a metric called the transparency score.
Okay.
It's not the perfect metric either. There's no such thing as a perfect way to grade or measure pollsters. But the transparency score basically said, if you're showing us how you're weighting your data, you're reporting to the American Association of Public Opinion Research, which is kind of a third-party, independent company that analyzes poll data. If you're transparent with your data, that's a good sign that you're doing things the right way. And so he gives pollsters kind of a boost in his ratings if they are transparent. And if we zoom way out, if we take polls all the way back to, the 90s, pollsters who are transparent with their data are more accurate by the current metrics. They're more accurate than pollsters who are not transparent. What ends up happening is these partisan pollsters who are consistently overstating candidates of their party, they're close on elections where their candidates happen to win. That's again, we're measuring in many cases luck. In probability, and this is something that I talk about with people who are good at math, understand numbers. In probability, you can make your own luck. If you have good numbers, if you have a good model, you can make your own luck. You're more likely to be close with a good model than a bad model. But guess what happens if you have a bad model and you're lucky? You're still close. You can still win. You can go all in a poker hand with a very bad hand. Someone else can say, hey, don't go all in. I have aces. They're like, no, I got this. And you say, okay, I call.
Yeah.
But guess what? Sometimes someone who is luckier,
you just get lucky.
Better than someone. Yeah. Exactly. So we have to get away from this mindset of whoever's closest was the best for forecasts, for polls, for poll averages, all of it. A sample size of one election is so meaningless, but we assign so much meaning to it. And one last point I want to make, because we saw it very, very prominently this year. And it's a problem that I talk about in my book. It's a problem that I said, if we don't fix this, this is exactly what's going to happen. And here's why that's a problem. It's hurting. Pollsters pushing their numbers, nudging their numbers closer to the averages. Here's the example that I gave in one of my social media posts. I said, if you take a poll in a state like Pennsylvania and you observe 5246, those are your poll numbers. And you look at the poll averages and you say, wait, the poll averages are all very close. What's to stop that pollster from saying, okay, I'm not going to report 5246. I'm going to apply this weight here and this weight here. And now it says 5048. Now I'm still saying the candidate who I observed at 52 is ahead, but I'm exposing myself to less risk if the election ends up very close. If the candidate at 46 ends up winning, now I'm exposing myself to less reputational risk of my poll being wrong. Nate Silver hates this. He hates it because it contaminates his averages, right? Yeah. So if polls are all taken by a valid methodology, reported transparently, you are going to get in a close election, let's say the poll averages should be 48-48. If we took a census, you would return 48-48. Well, mathematically, you should get some 51s and 52s for both candidates. If you take enough polls, they cancel each other out to the point where Nate's average ends up nice and good. But he doesn't judge pollsters by that. He judges pollsters by each individual pollster. How close were you? So let me ask you this. What is a pollster's incentive for reporting what they perceive to be a borderline outlier? What is their incentive?
Not a whole hell of a lot. I mean, I guess a lot of online ridicule and possibly a lower grade.
They have no incentive to report anything that deviates too much from the average because of the standard that Nate Silver and the consensus of analysts in this field use. They should never report their poll data as they observe it. And it's his fault. He's complaining about something that he contributes to the problem. He created this monster, and now he's complaining about it existing. Why would you ever, if your reputation is being determined by one poll or one state closest to the election, why would you ever report something that is a fringe outlier? You shouldn't. You should hurt. That's what his analysis leads to.
And by the way, this is why I give full pardon to Ann Seltzer. Not that she needs the pardon of this podcast, but I was pumped that she just threw something wild out there. Like, I didn't know if it was right. It didn't seem right to me in the moment, but I'm just happy that she said, oh, look, I am looked at as a gold model of this field. Here's a wild ass poll. I'm throwing it out there. It's my final one. I'm going to splash the waters and we'll see where it comes in. Oh, I was very, 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 very wrong. Oops.
Yep.
Guess what?
Yep.
You're still going to come talk to me in Des Moines in 4 years. So eat it. Like, it doesn't matter. She's still going to be somebody that at least we know she's going to follow her methodology, and maybe her methodology is wrong. Maybe she's going to do more or better going forward, but at least she's not afraid to release it. And I did really like that point when you made it, that it's like, because I know that Nate Silver obviously is the big dog in this field. He has an outsized influence, especially in terms of his margins. And we are now at a very snake eating its tail period where the reflections of our race now also just move our race faster than it ever has in the past. It's the reason why I'm positive that John Ralston, who knows Nevada better than anybody, when I was reading his live blog of all the early vote coming in, and I've read him every cycle that I've cared about elections, especially for Nevada, I was like, oh, he thinks Trump's going to win.
Yeah.
He like the way he's writing, knowing that he hates Trump. I'm like, knowing what he is writing and the people that he are citing and what they're saying, I'm like, he's not dumb. He thinks Trump's going to win. And then he releases his predictions. And I believe that it happened. He said that Kamala was going to win by the skin of her teeth. And I'm like, you didn't want to make a story. You didn't want the story to be, and he knew it, and he was right, by the way, that if John Ralston came out and said Donald Trump was going to win Nevada, that would have been more of a problem for him, that he would have been in the crosshairs of a media storm that wasn't worth it. He would rather be wrong on this and live to see another day than to be right on it and say that Donald Trump was going to win, even if it was actually a more accurate prediction. And so while Nate Silver is certainly a big figure, I also think Twitter's a huge part. I also think that the question of this very uncertain world of polling of, hey, by the way, where do these make money? How do any of these firms like fund any of this? It used to be media outlets. Now there's no media outlets unless, let's say, between now and the next cycle, if my Substack blows up, your Substack blows up, and we got enough cash that we're like, screw it. Let's pull our money together and run a bunch of battleground polls just for laughs. Yeah. Maybe that is a different world. And maybe at that point, if it's just our communities that are funding it, then we have less of an incentive to say, oh, I'm going to be scared because people on Twitter yell at me. It'll be more about, hey, here's the methodology. But I do think that we're in an extraordinarily weird period where pollsters are scared. The audience has never been more jittery. They know enough to be dangerous, which is always the worst part of any kind of field. But at the same time, there are a lot of them that are out there. And I guess I'm going to fall victim to the fallacy that you hate the most. They were kind of close.
Yeah. When we talk about quality pollsters, Seltzer, her reputation was built not on the fact that her methodology was great or any of these other different factors. But if you remember reading on social media, they said, oh, she was very, very close on the margins in all of these past elections. Yeah. And again, I love Ann Seltzer. She is an excellent pollster, extremely transparent, and she does great work. But even people that we like, even people who do good work, we have to be wary of giving them too much credit. Too much credit where it's not due, too much blame where it's not due. And for better or for worse, when we're dealing with polls, when we're dealing with forecasts, it kind of goes both ways. Pollsters get too much credit when their polls are close, and they take too much blame when they're not. And same with forecasters. Forecasting is different. It's a little bit harder in terms of quantifying the range of outcomes, but it's the same deal. And so when Seltzer put out that poll, I actually reached out to them. I sent them a message on X. I sent a message to one of her employees, sent her an email, and I said, we're going to need to have a conversation about this poll after the election, because not because your poll was bad, but because I know you guys are going to get a ton of backlash if what is likely to happen, Harris loses Iowa by 7 or 8. I think she actually ended up losing it by 10 or something. Do you have the numbers there?
Yeah. I'll look it up. You go ahead.
But yeah, so I said, if this plays out the way I think it will, and that your margins for the first time in over a decade are catastrophically wrong, you guys are going to take a bunch of undue backlash from people who are judging you by the Literary Digest standard. And they're going to compare you to these unscientific pollsters. Now, Ann Seltzer, her reputation, her just I think everything about the way she conducts her business, she doesn't care. So when she saw 47, 44, she didn't think, oh, I shouldn't release this. Oh, I should nudge these numbers to make them look a little bit more. No, she said, oh, okay, those are the numbers. That is what we should want from a good pollster. But again, going back to what we were talking about before, what is her incentive for putting out those numbers? To be told how wrong she is after being such a great pollster for a decade? Like, we have to fix these standards, because Nate wants this. Every analyst wants more independent pollsters who don't herd their data. Well, guess what? The standards for that are in my book. How we get back to that are the standards that we need to start using, not the standards that Silver just released his, how accurate the polls were based on his poll averages and all of this. Like, yeah, if you heard all of these polls closer to an average, then you're more likely to have more accurate polls. But that is not what we should want from poll data, more accurate polls. I have to use quotes, because you're not getting more accurate polls. You're getting kind of blended polls and predictions. And that's not what we want.
Donald Trump won Iowa by 14 points. And
so Harris ended at
so
what,
that
43?
was a 17. She got 42.7. So a little under 14 points. Donald Trump won by. So, yeah, that was a 17-point miss if we were going to go by the margins as far as the Ann Seltzer poll. Not great. But also, it's like, again, if Ann Seltzer can live to tell the tale, so can you. So can you. Everybody can avoid. Everybody can take an outlier, and that's something that, like, I mean, the one more thing that I do want to talk to you about this election, because as we got closer to the end, you know, I felt like everybody was very, very tight. Even in the take industrial complex, there weren't a whole lot of like blue Texases or red New Jersey predictions like you have seen in the past, where things are a little bit more fluid. One of the more aggressive takes with one of the folks that we like to have on the show, Edinger Mentum, was that this was not a toss-up, that Kamala Harris was a pretty steady favorite. And part of the reason why was because he was very much of the belief that this was going to be a blue national environment, like a blue Democrat +3 environment. And one of the things that had been repeated a lot was the Washington state primary, a bellwether primary that normally is predictive of a national environment. That showed, I believe, a D+3 environment. And so that's where a lot of these takes were kind of built from. What are your thoughts on some of these bellwether indicators? How much do you take them seriously? Considering the fact that in that New York Times map that got so famous with all of the red arrows, the one little patch that was pointing blue was
Yeah.
the area where the Washington primary was. And so this one unfortunately took a gigantic L. But how seriously do you take these?
Beware of historical trends. For most of electoral history, elections have been basically average, right? Both parties would run a candidate that they believed had the best chance to win. Those candidates tended to be more moderate. They appealed to what we considered at the time the middle. There have been a few exceptions throughout history, but for the most part, on average, elections are average. But as we've seen recently with polarization of the electorate, with MAGA becoming such a weird faction of conservatism, is that these historical trends have become not useless, but they've become far less of a solid indicator. This happened in 2022, where the midterm curse, everybody was talking about how Democrats were probably going to lose a bunch of seats in the Senate and the House because, well, the party in power tends to not do well in the midterms. Well, these historical trends, you have to take them. You have to take more information than just the trend. Why did that trend exist in the first place? So to your point about the Washington state primary, Washington state might not be undergoing the same influences as the Midwest, for example.
Yeah.
In the Midwest and the Sun Belt too, but largely the Midwest are where the biggest electoral shifts have been happening. It's where the swing states are. So all of these data points are interesting. All of these data points can be useful, but we have to be very, very careful of drawing definitive or even probabilistic conclusions based on this historical pattern. Because as we know, correlations are not always, they don't always hold true. Some of those correlations are real, by the way. I'm not talking about spurious correlations. Some of those correlations are real, but the reason that they're real, there's sometimes an underlying factor that explains why that's the case. The midterm curse, for example. Why does the party in power tend to lose seats in the midterm? Well, the president who wins tends to have strong coattails. Those coattails usually lead to slight overperformances in those close House districts. And so any district that can go one way can go the other. Like the underlying reasoning can make sense. But if you don't account for that, or if you give too much weight to these historical trends, you can be slightly or dramatically misled.
Yeah. To real quick go back to a point I wanted to make about the Ann Seltzer poll. The two big things there, and again, I'm very, very happy that she released it. I have no shade for Ann Seltzer, but she released a poll that showed Donald Trump would lose men by 2 in Iowa. I think that is something that, if it were to come to pass, would be shocking. It certainly did not. But also, I know from my perspective, and this is where I tend to put polling, is that it is something that is very hard to get right. It's hard to even get right in the aggregate. It's hard to understand what is going to be relevant in this cycle versus last cycle, and what data is good data, what data is not great data. I know that I was in Des Moines in 2016, and I know how many votes Ted Cruz got to beat Donald Trump in that caucus. And I was also in Des Moines in 2024 when it was colder than the surface of Mars, to the point where I saw cars sliding down ice hills, abandoned cars sliding down ice hills. It looked like The Walking Dead. I did not leave my hotel to drive anywhere without skidding. And Donald Trump got more people to leave their house than Ted Cruz got in that caucus. And so, you look at that and I'm like, I don't think in a calendar year where Donald Trump gets shot in the face and survives is going to do worse than he did in the previous Iowa stuff. But again, it's like, none of this matters. My anecdotal experience doesn't particularly matter. It certainly matters to me because it is my gut. It informs my experience. But this is all stuff that we need to put together, and there are smarter ways to do it and there are dumber ways to do it. And I just hope we keep finding the smarter ways.
Yep. That's what I'm working on. That's what I'm trying to do. And that is, if I make a contribution to this field that is substantial, it will not be in the area of forecasting. My forecasts are pretty good, but they're not that good. Polling, maybe I can offer some assistance, but there are people who are better at it than me. Where I will make a contribution is by bringing valid scientific standards to political polling, because in any individual election, 2024, 2026, 2028, these contributions are minuscule. Sometimes they're negligible. But at some point, the things that I have to say, the observations, the analysis that I make, they're going to be so relevant that it will only be obvious in hindsight. Only by this literary digest standard of, oh, well, obviously because of this, this, and this, there are so many things that are important. And it's really unfortunate the election played out the way that it did. And no matter what would have happened, that doesn't give more or less credibility to my work. But there's an inherent kind of, it feels almost inappropriate so quickly after the election to try and promote your work about poll data, because nobody wants to talk about it right now. Like, people are just like, just give us some time off. But where, to your point, where my work is going to start making inroads now are with the academics, are with the quants, with the people who really want to understand this stuff, not in the sense of I want to predict this specific election outcome, because we know that that's not a good use of poll data, but people who really want to understand it and improve the field. That is where this book will have, and my work in general, will have a lot of value.
Well, I hope everybody heads out there and gets it. The polls weren't wrong, of course, by Carl Allen, and somebody that we will continue to have on the show. We very much enjoy his perspective on this stuff. Anytime that we can get better and smarter in the polling data, which I've always said, everybody gets so uptight about this. Like, Jon Stewart went viral for screaming about the polls and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, man, it's part of a balanced breakfast. Yeah. It's on the plate. Like, nobody should take it super seriously. I know that there's a lot of twitchy people that go nuts on Twitter whenever one thing happens or the other. And you're right. You see these, people act like it's a football game where a poll comes out in the morning and you're winning, and then your bad poll comes out in the afternoon and you're losing. That's not healthy. You shouldn't be doing that. Among all the unhealthy behavior on Twitter, that is certainly one of the most unhealthy behaviors on Twitter. But still, just put it in its proper perspective. It is a good idea. But you've given me some ideas on rubrics of, like, if you just historically look at candidate, what a candidate has done vote share wise in a race, where historically the party has needed to be vote share wise in the candidate, and where the breakage of undecideds are. Maybe there's something that's not necessarily a number poll, but like a to-do list for a candidate of, like, hey, you should be getting to this certain point historically, if historically you are going to give yourself a shot to win. Anything beyond that is an aberration that it's going to be harder to tell, but maybe that's a better kind of fundamental thing. I don't know. At least we got a couple years to noodle on it. And we've got some time to read The Polls Weren't Wrong by Carl Allen and to read his Substack. Carl, where else can people find you?
You can find me on X. You can find me on Threads, Substack, all of the above, at Real Carl Allen. Again, if you're interested in understanding poll data better, the book is a great place to start. My Substack is also a great place to start. There's a lot of not very technical, but there's more technical discussions on my Substack than maybe that I'll have on places like X and Threads. So if you're into that, definitely follow me, read, and comment. So I don't have a ton of followers. I usually respond to people who are either, if you're critical of me, genuinely, I'll respond. We can have a conversation. Even if you're overly nice about my work, I will also respond and tell you to be more critical, because I take praise about as well as I take criticism. Which I view them as kind of one and the same. But if you're giving me praise for a valid reason, I'll take it. But if you're giving me praise because of oh, you got this right, or you were right on for this. No, it's all just one and the same to me. We have to develop a better set of standards for analyzing data. Polls are an easy target. Polls are an easy target for people to put an external cause on all of the things that happen. They're such an easy target, but that target comes from a misunderstanding of how they work in the first place. So we have to be careful about assigning too much meaning to them. I'm rambling again, but thanks for having me on. I really hope that we can do better. And I'm not looking forward to 2026 yet, not looking forward to 2028 yet. I tried to take at least a day off between the election. But once we get there, I hope we can get a little bit better with each election.
Oh, come on. Carl, we got the New York City mayoral race. We got the Virginia governorship. Don't worry. We're going to be here for all the sicko stuff. All the total political degeneracy will be on this podcast. Carl, thank you so much for joining us.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
And that'll wrap it up for us today. Politics, written and hosted by me, Justin Robert Young, for Dog and Pony Show Audio here in Austin, Texas. A chilly Austin, Texas. I don't have my watch on, so I can't see exactly what the temperature is, but it began today sub 50, 48 degrees. Get your jackets out, Central Texas. Ooh, very exciting. If you'd like to send me an email about anything, please go ahead and do it, theyoungamerican@gmail.com. And I'll say this. If you volunteered in this election on either side of the aisle, any side of the aisle, really, any of the parties, send me your thoughts on how all that went. I got a very interesting email from somebody who volunteered on one of the major campaigns. They had some interesting insights and anecdotes as to how things went. But I would love to hear from any and all of you. Of course, you can find, follow, and share video clips of this show, TikTok, Justin R. Young, Instagram, Justin R. Young, and X at Justin R. Young. If you would like to join our ever-growing community in the video world, the visual realm, find us on YouTube, Politics. And, we get a lot of really cool comments on that channel. It is very, very nice, and I feel like we're in a bit of a golden moment for what we try to do on the show, a unbiased look at things, like actually unbiased, not like very obviously a partisan and then says they're unbiased, right? Like I am only beholden to me being correct, not me advancing a cause. So yeah, that radical self-interest, I feel like, has captured its own audience, and it has come through in the comments where people are mentioning it. It stands out on YouTube, which is cool. If you want to hit us with a one-time donation, you can. PayPal.me/payjury, PAYJURY. Venmo is Justin-Young-20. Cash App is PX3Cash. And you send me anything you'd like in the mail. P.O. Box 153184, Austin, Texas 78715. Again, that is Post Office Box 153184, Austin, Texas 78715. Now, the only place that you can get our bonus content is TakePoliticsSeriously.com. Brings us to our brand new home on Substack. And I got to tell you, we made the move. It was a terrifying move to make. It's been phenomenal. It's been fantastic. I think we are 70 subscribers away, paying subscribers away from being exactly where we were when we made the jump. Everybody else seems very happy. People have taken tremendous advantage of our $99 deal. That's 1 year of the program, 150 episodes of PX3 for only less than $100. But otherwise, it's the same deal that it's always been. In fact, a little bit better. It's $3 a week. If you'd buy me a cup of coffee, well, you can get 2 bonus episodes each and every week. And there's a lot of news for us to cover. That is $12 a month, hard capped from here on out. Thank you to everybody that's done it. It has been very, very, very appreciative. Of course, if you'd like your name read on the show, you got to get on our founding tier. And that is a little bit different than it used to be on Patreon, but it does mean that these names that I am about to read really believe in independent and unbiased political analysis. L3PO, Peepaw, Scott, Middle-Aged Mike, Tom, Sarah Jeannie, Jeremy, Pro Idiot, Chiller Tomatoes, oh yeah, it's Adam, Neil, AB Puppy, Dr. Whiskey, Michael, Fat Tony's PJs from New York, Will, The Borge B, Matthew, Matt, Andrew, Edwin, Sam, Andrew, Phil, Edison, Devon, Paul, A Dog Named Checkers, Gloria Young, my dear, sweet, darling mother, Jerry, Trucker, John, Berkeley Stephen, and Zombie Doc. If you would like your name read on the show, only one place to do it. TakePoliticsSeriously.com. Get on that founding tier. Next week, we've got a crossover episode with another political podcast. We're going to have both hosts of another political podcast on the show. Very excited about that. And a few surprises. Obviously, a lot still going on here. We're going to cover all of it. Till next time, this is your old pal, Justin Robert Young, saying, some shows talk about politics, others talk about politics, and still more discuss politics. But this is the only show that dares discuss, three.
Diamond Club hopes you have enjoyed this program.
Dog and Pony Show audio.